So it is now my privilege to introduce the next panel, which will be on democracy in the public age, featuring two philosophers and a political theorist. There's one change in the program. Chris Robichaud, unfortunately, is not able to join us, and Justin Pottle was able to and kind enough to fill in very short notice. So to introduce the panelists in the way they are seated to my left, so to my immediate left is Susanna Siegel, distinguished colleague at the philosophy department up the road, who is actually mostly known as a specialist in epistemology, philosophy of mind, has had more and better things to say about perception than most people in human history, but also has fascinating interest in areas that are not obviously connected to perception. She taught for a long time a class on moral reasoning about social protest. And in recent times has gotten more interested in the field of philosophy of journalism, and also is journalistically active for a periodical in Florida, I think. Yeah. We can talk more about it later. And to her left, we have Matt Macdonald, who is a PhD student in the philosophy department, who is writing a dissertation about the right not to be misled, question mark, as you just said, but with interesting, it seems, applications to a range of policy domains, like including climate change. So if you have good things to say about that nexus to policy, we may not let you leave the Kennedy School, so be careful, with that area. So Matt Macdonald will join us then, and Justin Pottle, who is finishing up a dissertation on democratic equality in the misinformation age. Nothing more needs to be said about the relevance of that thesis. So without further ado, Susanna, over to you.
Matt is going to be.
Matt is going to go first. Yeah, okay.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be joining this conversation about a right to truth, because I'm interested in kind of pushing as far as I can the case for a really similar right, which is a right not to be misled. My dissertation is like just kind of the first few steps of that project. And I'm not like sort of super necessarily committed to the idea that there's an anti-misinformation right like from the outset, but it strikes me that a promising way to work out whether there is such a right is to kind of see how far I can push the case for it. And then if it turns out that it succeeds, then that's great, and if it turns out that it fails, maybe some of the ways in which it would fail could be quite instructive. So that's kind of what my overall project is. Now, I'm sort of thinking about rights here as, I'm thinking about what a right against misinformation would involve, or what it would be, is something like an exception from the category of protected speech, that is speech protected under the right to free speech. Making that exception kind of open to regulation, open to either some forms of direct censorship or other ways to kind of reduce the prevalence of misinformation, where the structure of that exception is not like ad hoc. It's not like a sort of ad hoc exception to freedom of speech or the category of protected speech for like this type of speech or that kind of minor type of speech in a particular context. But the idea of kind of collecting these into an anti-misinformation right would be to kind of unify them, unify these different cases into something which is kind of has a coherent explanatory structure. And this is based on like a background conception of rights as kind of like protections on certain basic interests and freedoms, about which I'll say more in just a moment, from systematic threats to those basic interests and freedoms, in the form of like kind of close to all things considered reasons for restrictions on behavior that come at tolerable cost to other basic rights and interests. So it's really important to sort of specify what's meant by basic rights and interests, or what's meant by basic interests in particular. So these are kinds of like things that I can assume from the outset, without knowing anything about what your comprehensive doctrine comprehensive conception of the good is, there are certain things that I can assume from the outset are going to be good for you. So I may not know whether you are a Catholic or a Protestant or an atheist or a Muslim or whatever, but I can be pretty sure, I can be pretty justified in assuming like from the outset that you have a basic interest in just like some minimum of like physical health and safety, things like that, physical security and so forth. There are also like collective interests, collective basic interests that we have. So these are things like our collective interest in avoiding ecological catastrophe or economic collapse, as well as like kind of collective basic interests in like democratic self-government and sort of democratic freedom generally, something like that. Now, there are some relatively clear cases of misinformation that plausibly seem to threaten a lot of these basic interests. So think about like, you're probably familiar with the long history of like tobacco industry sponsored misinformation that's aimed at obscuring the fact that like smoking causes cancer. There's also like, pandemic denial or the denials for many public figures early in the COVID-19 pandemic about like the existence and sort of severity of the threat. There's like anti-vaccine kind of stuff. There's also misinformation that plausibly threatens or systematically threatens collective basic interests in things like not having ecological collapse. So I'm thinking of like climate change denialism, stuff like that. And it's arguable that given the current configuration of the media ecosystem, the kind of infosphere, and the available communication technologies, it seems like the threat is in many cases kind of systematic. It's not like a sort of one-off ad hoc kind of threat, but something that's like repeatable, predictable, significant, and so forth. Now, in many of these cases, and this kind of gets to why I'm not trying to define like misinformation in general or anything that can, like everything that can plausibly be called misinformation. In many of these cases, what I'm interested in is a sort of carefully defined subcategory of misinformation where that is defined as like mass speech that systematically obscures certain credibly settled facts. We can talk about what credibly settled facts amount to maybe in the Q&A. It's going to be a big question. It's going to depend on what you think the right account of like how to distinguish trustworthy science from like non-trustworthy consensus is. But it seems like in these cases there's like mass speech that systematically obscures certain credibly settled facts where knowing those facts is essential to safeguarding the basic interests. Kind of a good analogy here is with like false advertising and product labeling. These are like exceptions to the category of protected speech where it's uncontroversial because the relevant interests are very, very clear and the relevant facts are very well settled. So if you have like a bleach manufacturer who goes around advertising that their product is safe to drink and then they get punished under like laws against false advertising, it doesn't seem like that would be a controversial kind of or objectionable sort of exemption from the category of speech that's protected under the free speech right, because the interests are really clear. Drinking bleach is gonna like kill you or really mess you up, and the fact that drinking bleach is bad for you is like super well settled. So there's a kind of a direct like threat to basic interests kind of argument for an anti-misinformation right. But I think a deeper problem lies in the kind of threat that misinformation poses to autonomy, because a lot of the defenses of free speech rights are intimately connected with a kind of a concern for protecting like the autonomy of hearers to sort of, our autonomy to kind of like think for ourselves, to decide what to believe, this kind of enlightenment ideal of like think for yourself and not have your thoughts, opinions, behaviors and so forth dictated to you or for you or decided for you. There's a kind of concern with like allowing people to work out for themselves what to believe without being played like a tune by people in positions of power. In my dissertation, I argue that like even even defenses of free speech that on the surface appeal predominantly to other kinds of values, like epistemic values. Think of like Mill's free speech arguments about like the right way to get at truth and so forth, as well as like democratic arguments that appeal to like the importance of free speech in having a good functioning democracy or a legitimate democracy. I argue that even those types of justifications are ultimately reliant on a kind of background commitment to that kind of value of individual autonomy. We can talk about why that is if you want in Q&A. I'm trying to not take too long with giving you the overview of my project here. But it sort of seems that it's really important to look at the effect misinformation would have on people's autonomy, simply because one objection to having an explicit anti-misinformation right would be, well, can't I decide for myself what to believe? Like maybe it's my responsibility as a citizen or as a sort of a good, thoughtful person to decide what to believe rather than have it decided for me, something like that. So we can distinguish, I think, two ways in which misinformation undermines or threatens autonomy. The really simple version, or the kind of obvious case, is a case where like you fall for the misinformation, you make decisions based on it, and there's a sense in which you're kind of manipulated by the deception. If I can if a powerful person can convince you, to go out and protest against, stop the steal, and protest against the legitimate election result, because they've tricked you into sort of thinking that it was stolen. There's a sense in which you're being played like a tune. Your decision is someone else's decision in a way, or it's expressive of someone else's kind of values, or sort of that's maybe not the right way of putting it, but it's in some sense not your own decision. I think that's actually the least interesting of the two ways in which misinformation undermines autonomy, especially because like the effects of misinformation are not always such that, like the threat is not always that you end up falling for it or believing it, but it sort of affects the structure of the information environment in ways that make it a lot more costly to think for yourself, but also I think they kind of reflect an unfair allocation of responsibility that is intellectual responsibility in certain cases. And so to kind of illustrate what I mean, I'll just propose a little thought experiment. So suppose myself and my friend Justin are co-teaching a course, and I say to Justin, Justin, you're such a good teacher. I know that it's no effort for you. Can you maybe teach all of the lectures and sections for this course, and I'll just sit back and do nothing. And it's because you're so good at teaching, I know it's not going to be any effort for you. Now, there's a sense in which I'm treating Justin as perfectly capable of teaching. I'm in some sense respecting his capacity to teach by sort of not pretending he can't teach or something like that. But there's a deeper sense, I think, in which I would be disrespecting his capacity. I would be kind of exploiting or overburdening it, or allocating the responsibility in an unjust way. And I think when we demand that people think for themselves, or encourage people to think for themselves, and then kind of bombard them with misinformation, or if we respond to a media ecosystem where this information is rampant, and you sort of say to people, it's your own responsibility to kind of wade through all the muck. There's a sense in which it's not like respecting people's ability to think for themselves. It's exploiting them by making it the case that not only can they think for themselves, but they have to. Like, there's a sense in which it's overburdening and exploiting the capacity rather than respecting it. And I think the sort of the defense of a really stringent freedom of speech right that makes that kind of appeal, it really relies on misunderstanding what it would take to respect people's intellectual capacities, people's capacity to think for themselves. Like there's a sense in which, if I go to the doctor and I ask, what's the evidence for whether the vaccine is safe and effective? Can you just tell me, is it gonna kill me, or is it gonna help? And then the doctor gives me 500 articles on it. It's like, wade through all this and think for yourself. like I shouldn't have to do that. You know, I should be able to kind of defer to reliable judgment in that case. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. That's just some features of the project that I'm working on. Obviously, this is not going to get us like all the way to a right to truth or a right against misinformation. Like we still need to look at things like how do we define this category of credibly settled facts, and sort of you know, could we get protections against misinformation that would come at tolerable cost to other basic interests and rights. But hopefully I've said enough to kind of motivate the idea that there is actually a much more interesting autonomy-based case for an anti-misinformation right than we might have initially thought. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I'm using slides, so it's going to take a sec here. Is this working? Okay, thanks very much for coming, and thanks to Sushma and Mathias and Risse for your work organizing. So Matt has just talked to us about a right against being misled, and we started the day talking about the idea that there is a right to truth, or what kind of rights those might be, what kinds of truths it might apply to. And I think of this project as, you know, thinking through what kinds of grounds we could have for penalizing disinformation. What kinds of grounds we could have for criticizing more generally aspects of mass communication that inhibit democracy instead of promoting it or cultivating it. So it does have this direct policy question in terms of clarifying for us what kinds of policies could reflect these rights. If we could clarify what the rights were, that might give us some values we could use to guide the policies. And in this kind of cluster of questions, we're sort of starting with a class of truths that are important to know, and then we're asking what might ground our right to know them. And that's supposed to give us normative leverage against disinformation and normative leverage perhaps for a healthier political communication sphere. And I guess I think of this type of inquiry as maybe belonging to one of two fronts against disinformation. There's the regulative front, where we're analyzing dynamics of disinformation so that we can understand what it would take to regulate it, looking for normative grounds for that regulation. But I want to focus on a second front, a different type of front, which I'm thinking of as the insurance front. So, you know, what could we do to prevent the uptake of disinformation if it was there? And we can ask this question about institutions. We can also ask this question at sort of level of the habits of mind that institutions could prompt or cultivate in us. So I'm interested in what kinds of principles might provide insurance against the uptake of disinformation of various kinds. And I'm going to think through this in my short time here by focusing mainly on news journalism. Could ask what principles of news journalism ensure against disinformation. And when we ask the question this way, the sort of immediate answer that might come to mind is, well, fact-checking. You know, journalism, professionalized journalism, you know, has this kind of institutional ways of filtering out falsehoods. So there's fact-checkers. One of the skills you learn as a journalist is knowing how to verify things. Then there are, of course, the institutionalized penalties for falsehood, like you can sue the newspaper for libel and things like that. Famously, you can't do that on social media. So these are the sort of things that come obviously to mind because of the things we bemoan when they're not there. But I think, and I'm going to focus on a sort of different dimension of an answer to this question of what types of principles of news journalism could ensure against disinformation. And that's not so much principles that have to do with truth, but principles that have to do with selection, which I call salience principles. So I'll talk a little bit about salience principles. So if we ask here, what kinds of content or frames should be foregrounded in news journalism, that's a different sort of question from, given that somebody says something, how can we check whether it's true? So this is an instance of a very general, a general distinction that we find in many domains of inquiry. So on the truth, there's these two separable dimensions, and I'm going to emphasize for a bit the extent to which they really are separate dimensions. So on the truth dimension, we ask things like, you know, given a belief or a statement, is it true? Is it verified? Is it supported by evidence? So here, we're just given a belief or a statement that we're asking these questions about. How we got to be entertaining this belief or this statement is just sort of left off stage. Whereas the selection dimension puts those things on stage. We ask, well, which truths are sought? Which questions should direct inquiry? What should be the content of the news in the case of journalism? And you can see various ways of seeing how independent these two parameters are. So one way to see how independent they are is thinking about the temporal dimension to selection. So if you think about the timing of leaks, so yesterday's leak about Roe v. Wade reoriented attention and therefore reoriented outrage to the fact that the Supreme Court opinion was leaked, which means it reoriented attention away from the opinion itself and its enormously violent consequences it would have if put into law. Another example is, of course, the 2016 leak of John Podesta's email from the Democratic National Committee, which was timed exactly to distract from the Access Hollywood tape, which had been released just the day before. So here we have clear problems with political communication. We have clear problems in the public sphere, in the domain of politics. But the problem is not about half-truth. The problem is not about lack of truth. The problem is not about distortion. The problems are exclusively about salience. Another way to see the distinction between selection dimension and the truth dimension is when we ask what sorts of questions should orient inquiry, like in the medical context. You know, which values should guide which medical research will be pursued? Should it be we should pursue the medical research questions that will become the most profitable once we get answers to them, or should we pursue the medical research programs that will prevent the most harm? These are obviously very different principles of selection for inquiry, but either one you follow could produce absolutely true, flawless studies and medical knowledge. So that's the salience dimension, that's the selection for inquiry dimension, and I'm emphasizing how it's independent of the dimension of truth and verification and even of knowledge. Just a few more examples of this independence. You could have two history books, they're both full of knowledge, but one is just far more illuminating than the other one. You could have two experimental studies, both are flawless in what they control for and in their method, but one is on a flawed question. So when Joan Donovan mentioned the ivermectin studies, that could belong here. The study might have been fine, the study might have been methodologically absolutely flawless, but yet it never should have been done. Why shouldn't it have been done? Because you don't ask a question if you know the answer, or if you know, likely to know, if you know that it's very likely that this thing won't work. There's just no point in inquiring into it. And the reason people did inquire into it was not really because they wanted to know the answer and they needed to know the answer. It was about the function that having it be salient would serve. Okay, and then in the domain of journalism, you could have two news stories about the same event. They're both absolutely full of truths. They're both done flawlessly journalistically, yet one is extremely misleading. It doesn't really tell you what happened, even though you can't fault it for on grounds of fact-checking or verification. And when I teach philosophy of journalism, I take advantage of the amazing sort of apology movement among historically white newspapers that have kind of turned back and looked at their own past coverage, in this case, their past coverage of race relations in the US. This was a 6-part series published by the Kansas City Star in December 2020. And they devoted an amazing amount of resources to looking back at 140 years of their coverage, and often, and this is pedagogically extremely useful, they would compare coverage of the same event by the Kansas City Star at that time versus the Kansas City Call, a historically black newspaper, and just lays out exactly that the differences were exclusively differences in the questions that were asked in the news stories themselves. So a quick example about school desegregation, which is of course a big issue in Kansas. The Kansas City Star says of its own past coverage, we had written about boundary changes that occurred at a school board meeting, but we didn't make the connection as to why they were making these boundary changes. So you would have we didn't dig deep enough to make the connection that it was to keep the schools segregated, to keep white children in one part of town and black children in another part of town, which was also a violation of federal law at the time. So interestingly, we didn't dig deep enough. We didn't make the connection. So this is about which questions you're asking, which consequences you're thinking through. They're about the dimension of inquiry. They're not about fact or verification. Okay, so if we were looking for salience principles, we would ask, what kinds of principles could we use to regulate this in some way? And something like this came up in the domain in Joan Donovan's talk when she was talking about search algorithms. What is going to be made salient when you ask a certain question from the algorithms? But these questions arise for any domain of inquiry. There's always a need for salience principles that could guide which inquiries you undertake and therefore which contents will be made most salient. So I'm just going to spend the rest of my time thinking through Salience Principles for journalism. Journalism has procedural principles. It has skills and methods, and those are what you learn in journalism school. But does it have content principles? And every time I try to talk to journalists about this, I ask them, I never get some answer about kind of general principles of content. And that's because, it's like, well, look, you write about what's important for the public to know about. And then, the philosopher in me is like, well, what is important for the public to know about? And then the journalist is like, well, if you can actually get to have a conversation about this, it just is like, look, you just got to go to the time and the place, and you got to figure out once you're on the ground whether the problem is what should we do with this old leftover building that's now been abandoned by the factory that left, or what should we do about the corner of Mass and Cass, or whatever it might be. But the philosopher in me thinks, well, maybe is it just possible to articulate Salience principles about content? And if we could do that for journalism, perhaps they might apply to other forms of mass communication as well. So that's the philosopher in me, trying to think through how those principles might contribute to the insurance front. And so here are a couple ideas about that. So on the insurance front of confronting disinformation, you could think about opportunities for inquiry. So I associate with John Dewey the idea that, I'm riffing off Mathias's wonderful discussion of the will to truth and the will to power. The will to value. But what about a will to inquire? A kind of felt drive or need to follow a story, to fill in one's knowledge gaps. If you think that that's a kind of basic drive to engagement that people have, what you might do if you were trying to answer to these things in Salience Principles is you would try to have institutions and practices that would identify the knowledge gaps, highlight them, and then leverage them in a better way than the way that was described in this morning. You would provide alternative ways to prompt inquiries. And in a way, the so-called new journalism, no longer new, it answered to this in a certain way. And the idea behind the new journalism was that instead of writing news articles that were just kind of, a report from the institutions of record, what you would do is make it as engaging as fiction. Of course, it wasn't fiction, but it was as engaging as fiction. So I think that's the kind of way of answering to opportunities for inquiry. But I'm going to focus more on a different idea, which I hope will segue nicely into Justin Pottle's discussion. So another aspect of the insurance front is how could you provide proof against calumny? So here's Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, who's saying, friendship between good men is alone proof against calumny. For a man is slow to believe anybody's word about a friend whom he has himself tried and tested for many years. Okay, friendship is alone proof against calumny. And of course he's talking about friendship among acquaintances, but there's also the thought that there is such a thing as political friendship, which isn't exactly among acquaintances. People might not know each other, but they stand in relations of co-citizenship, and people call that political friendship, even though it isn't really exactly friendship in our ordinary sense. But we could ask what kinds of attitudes or dispositions, habits of mind, might cultivate political friendship that could be proof against calumny, which means it could be insurance against the kind of disinformation that distorts the characterization of people with whom you share a polity, people with whom you share a society. So I started to think this through a little bit in this paper, Salience Principles for Democracy, which came out last year in this philosophy book of papers about salience. And what Salience Principles of journalism might provide proof against calumny in the context of political friendship. Well, one thought that I try to think through in this paper a little bit is that perhaps there's something we could call the public as protagonist principle for governing news journalism. The idea that you should frame stories in ways that will invite readers to see themselves as political protagonists with a stake in the polity. And I talked through some examples involving election coverage, the coverage of death, and accountability. I won't go through that here since it's in the paper. But I just end with one last idea, which I think may well connect to things Justin will talk about, which is when you think about the kinds of attitudes that could ground a theory of justice in liberal democracy, one sort of answer that's developed often in kind of Rawlsian Kantian context is that you should focus on respect. Like, what should you feel in political friendship? What attitudes should you have that should shape your relationship to these people you never met, but who you share society with? One idea is, well, you should respect their moral status. And look, you can't argue with that. I mean, there's nothing to object to in that. But you could observe that it targets the sort of most inner, abstract, unobservable features of humanity. So there's nothing, the whole point is, there's nothing you have to know about people in order to respect them. It's like Christian agape works like this as well. Whereas a different kind of answer, and it's not incompatible with respect, but it's just maybe, again, a separate dimension, is you could have concern. So what if we focused on concern as opposed to respect? Concern as opposed to respect. Concern is elicited far more readily by conceptions of people embedded in specific circumstances. And to develop that kind of attitude, you need something different. You don't need sort of the moral law within you only. Maybe you need that, maybe you don't. But you absolutely need stories about everybody in the polity that are engaging in the way fiction is, which is, of course, exactly what the new journalism part of it focused on. Not so much the part about everybody in the polity and concern and stuff like that, but the mode, what it would sound like, what it would be like, what kind of writing it would be, what kind of skills it would take, what you should be aiming at in writing this kind of journals. So maybe proof against calumny from journalism could relate members of polity to one another. This is obviously addressing only insurance against only one kind of disinformation, not so much about tobacco, ivermectin, and so on, but the type of thing that's going to vilify or criminalize members of the polity that you belong to. And so perhaps this is a dimension of epistemic justice, and that would be a Salience Principle for democracy. So now I'll turn it over to Justin.
So first off, thank you so much, Mathias, for inviting me to pinch hit for Chris to join this really fantastic panel and fantastic day of conversations. So what I want to do in the next 10 minutes or so is just to throw out some reflections that draw together some themes of a couple of research projects I'm working on that pick up some of the themes that Susanna and Matt have been talking about, as well as the last panel from the STS fellows were discussing. And what I want to do is to draw attention to what I see to be a relationship between American democracy's epistemic crisis, our information infrastructure, and our broader democratic ideals, namely political equality. So our misinformation crisis often gets described as a problem of equality run amok, that social media and the decline of traditional gatekeepers has leveled the playing field, it's turned us all into experts, and what we need to do to fix it is something like develop a new form of epistemic paternalism, or at least elite institutions to tether democracy together with some shared set of facts or knowledge. What I want to do is push back against the idea that confronting misinformation requires us to retreat from egalitarian principles, or at least to sketch one way that we can view our disorder as a problem or as a product of or exacerbated by persistent inequalities in the public sphere, what I think Sheila really provocatively called the problem of the epistemically dispossessed in the last panel. So in this view, rectifying misinformation doesn't just require new elite institutions. It also requires addressing or at least avoiding replicating the institutional legacies of racial, social, economic exclusion within our existing media institutions that still shape much of who and what gets heard in the public sphere. As with Susanna, I'm going to keep the focus on news journalism, as I know we're all, three of us are quite interested in it, but I don't think the argument is limited to it either. So to start, I take democracy to be a system of collective self-government in which persons participate as equals, both in formal decision-making, that is, through voting, and in the informal public debate that both precedes and follows voting. Most egalitarian theorists cash out this idea of informal political equality in terms of interpersonal deliberation, that is, practices or ideals of speaking to one another in a way that befits mutual respect between persons. Within this view, norms of deliberation are meant to secure each person's opportunity for influence in public debate by aiming to ensure that speakers' testimony is considered fairly on its epistemic merits and is free from prejudice. But in a public sphere of hundreds of millions, we can't obviously all talk face to face. We need to rely on elite institutions like news media to learn about one another and link us together in shared discourse to form these, as Susanna was mentioning, bonds of political friendship with people that we are never going to meet. But this dependence poses new challenges for an ideal of equality. So I want to pitch two examples, also drawn from news journalism. In her ethnography of rural Wisconsin, political scientist Kathy Kramer describes how rural citizens feel themselves forgotten within the Wisconsin news media, which they see as, quote, yet another institution out of touch with their lives. In an analysis that she does of daily newspapers' coverage of rural issues within the state, Kramer finds no difference in the quantity of coverage, the content, and the tone of reporting on rural issues between urban and rural papers. And she associates this finding with the fact that most journalists are, quote, trained to report in a way that resonates with a broader journalism community, not the communities that they are covering. And it's this tendency that reinforces rural communities' distrust of mainstream news in ways that are separate from, though interacting with, other determinants such as political conservatism. Second, African Americans are significantly underrepresented in American newsrooms. So following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, journalist Wesley Lowery argued that the whiteness of the press had warped its ability to report accurately on the protests that followed. In his words, quote, since American journalism's pivot to a model of professed objectivity, the mainstream has allowed what it considers objective truth to be decided almost exclusively by white reporters and their mostly white bosses. And those selective truths have been calibrated to avoid offending the sensibilities of white readers, end quote. And while African Americans and black communities report relatively higher levels of media trust than the general population, more specific and granular studies find that they also report deep skepticism of mainstream news reporting, particularly on racial issues. So while these cases are different in many ways, I think they underline them as a similar complaint. Rural and black citizens see themselves as participating unequally in the public discourses and inquiry that our news media sustains. Both feel that their lives and experiences are misconstrued in the narratives that reporters write about them and that ultimately reach wider publics. And it's for that reason that they distrust those institutions to accurately report on their interests, and that's because they don't. So this is, I suppose, a matter of concern in the language that Susanna just developed, that this is about how we learn about the experiences of other people, rather than just respecting them in some sort of abstract sense. So what I argue is that this sort of unequal consideration by news media implicates the same set of interests that, or as more direct forms of interpersonal deliberation do, in that they prevent citizens from having their claims considered fairly in public debates on their merits and without prejudice. But it also has broader impact on the structure of our information environment, and I think this is where equality links back up with misinformation. So I suggest that these sorts of inequalities within media institutions can exacerbate or promote the circulation of misinformation in several ways. First, persistent inequalities can lead nominally repeatable journalistic institutions to, as Susanna mentioned as well, ask the wrong sorts of questions, to focus in on a very narrow set of perspectives and concerns about what is newsworthy. And that can bias our perceptions of what is important or what's critical for our polity to pursue. But more damningly, I think it also can lead them to traffic in and reinforce pernicious stereotypes about excluded groups. So, for example, scholars like Marty Gillens and Travis Dixon, they show that news media vastly overrepresents black citizens in their reporting on crime and in their reporting on poverty and welfare, and that these biases in coverage often lead heavy news consumers to develop false beliefs about black criminality and levels of welfare dependence. Second, these sorts of misperceptions and false beliefs and the lack of countervailing perspectives can leave these dependent audiences at risk for further identity-based manipulation. So we can see this in how politicians and propagandists often rely on exactly dog whistles about black criminality and welfare dependence to gin up support for policies that work against black interests. Third, this is trickiest, I think, is that feelings of being ignored and misrepresented among the marginalized breed a not unjustified distrust of expert institutions and the knowledge that they produce. So this is, I think, one of the most interesting takeaways from the previous panel. And as work by political scientist Jonathan Ladd shows that such distrust in relatively authoritative or at least reliable expert institutions often leads people to end up trusting far less reputable sources that confirm their priors, and this can potentially open them up to further misinformation or further exposure to misinformation or manipulation. So my point here is that media institutions treat how media institutions treat citizens can influence how those institutions function to support democracy. And they also implicate our broader ability to communicate as political equals, even in our interpersonal lives. If we're held up with baggage of stereotypes and false media narratives, it creates an unequal epistemic or deliberative playing field that can prevent even well-calibrated deliberation from actually supporting democratic equality. And to see this, I think we can also look at what are the common arguments for the sorts of institutions that often are seen as bulwarks to misinformation, such as the press, which is seen as a source of the kind of true or at least reliable information that publics need to effectively govern themselves. And I think this is no doubt true in some sense, that when we see that when newspapers close, voters are less informed, they're more polarized, state and local governments are less likely to act responsibly. But recentering equality also shows us that it's not so simple. As people like Kramer and Lowry argue, systematically unequal news can inform us about budgets and campaigns and policy debates, and still undermine democratic ends by informing us unequally about the perspectives, experiences, and interests of other groups. So under such conditions, the information providing function of the press or other institutions can lead to outright false or grossly exaggerated beliefs that ultimately harm democratic functioning. So if journalism is to play a role in retethering our democracy to truth, then we can't just think about it as a neutral conduit for hard facts. Its value for democracy is ultimately conditional on the degree to which it respects the equality of citizens as participants in public inquiry. So as policymakers look to promote news journalism or other expert institutions tasked with producing shared epistemic goods, I think they need to think seriously about whose voices those institutions are designed to include and to design or reform them with an ideal of political equality in mind. And this can help guide policy and professional responses to the legitimacy crisis and economic challenges faced by traditional and new media in the digital age. So I'll leave it there. Looking for Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for these three incredibly illuminating contributions to this topic. Let me start with a somewhat provocative question by bringing my Nietzsche theme back in. So the Nietzsche theme here is really has been preoccupying me quite a bit, because it is really also a way of challenging how we as intellectuals connect to people who are not intellectuals. How we as people who devote our lives to the pursuit of truth relate to people who really don't, right? And who live lives that are largely sheltered from any temptation to pursue the truth. And so, from such a perspective, one could think of, say, merchants of misinformation, journalists who are speaking to particular echo chambers. One actually has a somewhat kinder than typically done by people with our background perspective on what they do. Namely, they're offering certain possibilities of living a human life in certain networks, and maybe these networks, like this outsourcing of reality to networks, right? So maybe this is driven by illusions, right? But it's the kind of illusions that keep a certain network viable for certain ways of being human. And again, this is as alien to me instinctively as I think it's to each of you. But from the point of view of the ideas that you presented, what would you respectively say? What exactly is wrong with that? With being that kind of journalist who is basically offering membership in an illusion-driven network? What exactly is the wrongness of that?
seems like you're playing your son on radio. I mean, Matt gave an account of what was wrong with that.
You want to give an account? I can give an account. I think
We can all speak
we'll be
different.
pretty different.
Should I?
Yeah.
You have another one. No, this is just that big one. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like there's a certain point where that kind of behavior may overstep and enter into a pattern where it long-term at scale starts to threaten and undermine the kind of basic civil democratic and liberal, that is to say freedom-oriented, preconditions for having a society in which different kinds of meaning making, different kinds of membership in a community can happen. Like it sort of seems like, I mean, to relate back to what you said earlier about the two Nietzschean wills, the will to value, that's going to be sort of social, collective, based on half-truths and stuff. But there's a preceding kind of will to truth where that gives you a baseline, or you sort of have to have a certain kind of access to a baseline level of truth that enables you to function and sort of maintain your functioning in the world, kind of regardless of what you then go on to make it meaningful, or what kind of mythology you then adopt. It sort of seems like if the latter kind of comes to eclipse and impede the former, it's going to become self-undermining. And it seems like there are types of narratives, that is to say democracy undermining or liberal autonomy undermining narratives, where we can understand them as overstepping or as distortions because they pose a systematic, at scale, long-term threat to the preconditions for having sort of different meaning-making communities and mythologies in the first place. I don't know if that quite gets to what you were asking about.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, and one of the things that I think is key is to recognize that democracy is prefaced on, some idea that you're right, that we do live in a pluralistic society in which people belong to specific networks and view the world in different ways, and that's not just a different normative vision; it's a fact of democratic politics. What I think the key is that even if that's true and we do belong to sort of specific meaning-making networks, we still are independent or interdependent in a meaningful sense. And so if we seek to govern ourselves across these different networks, we need some sorts of institutions that are both able to maintain some discussion across them. Otherwise, it just is complete fragmentation. So there is a need for something like bridging institutions that can connect these different networks and to show other people that there is a world beyond their other networks. And they don't necessarily need to all come to some sort of consensus, but maybe the ideal is something like that consideration or concern for others who you are necessarily interdependent with acts as some sort of constraint on the sort of localized meaning making. So I think that's one of the key things that journalism does, and journalism is obviously operating on multiple different sort of registers. Local newspapers function as a certain type of meaning making institution they're building the exact sort of network that you're talking about, but national newspapers, regional newspapers are also trying to draw connections between those. So we can see, I think, journalism as very much trying to reconcile the sort of Nietzschean vision that you're laying out and the sort of demands of living in a mass democracy in which we are very different spheres.
Yeah, I agree with what both Matt and Justin said. I guess I might press a little bit on the terms of the question, maybe by asking Nietzsche to draw maybe a further distinction among kinds of truth. So if we ask, what are we missing if we're denied the question says, well, what's missing from journalism that offers people membership as opposed to truth? And then I'm saying, well, suppose we draw some, make it a little bit more granular, membership as opposed to what Arendt called factual truths. It's a very confusing term. But if you leave out the truths about, did this politician take your tax money and buy a yacht, or didn't they? Or then the sort of well-known answer to what we lose with that is if we don't have those sorts of facts, then we don't have democratic accountability, and that's well documented. Whereas I guess I might question whether the people who are seeking membership, as opposed to the experts, are really not also seeking truth in one of two ways, maybe even both ways. So one way is like there might be actual truths, just even factual truths, again, straightforward, flat-footed truths that they do want to know about. It's just that they don't want the whole story of the microstructure of the universe, but maybe they want no story of the microstructure of the universe, but there still might be things that they do want to know. So the fact that they're kind of oriented around membership, I don't think precludes their being also oriented around truths. And then the other distinction, the other way of thinking about it is now truth, now not in the factual sense as if did Germany invade Belgium, or did Belgium invade Germany, in Arendt's example, but truth really now just standing in for belief. What do people take to be true? And to them, if you ask them, they'll be like, this is my truth. Now, for a philosopher, you're like, well, but whatever. Like, we can't get hung up with our little academic insideriness. There really is something people mean when they say, I'm going to tell you my truth. And that's absolutely, of a piece of membership. And part of what I was trying to bring out with the type of journalism that presents segments of the polity to one another is presenting those truths, even if they are integrating denials of factual truths, just to present it so you see, and that people feel heard and respected of what it is, as a first step. Like somebody said this morning, if you start off saying everything you believe is wrong and your sources are completely incredible, this is not a good political communication strategy. But to see yourself as a first step reflected in a discussion, I think could go a long way. So that's, again, a different way from the second way, in which membership, offering membership is not necessarily opposed to offering truth.
Okay, great, thank you. So floor is open. Let's stick with the tradition of please introduce yourself. Hilton, let's start with you. And ideally, you would have a question just to one member of the panel rather than we have a chance of getting more questions.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll ask Justin because I know him. My name is Hilton, and I'm a fellow at the Jasanoff Center for Ethics and also with the Harvard STS program. And just wanted to thank you for a really rich set of presentations. And I think I was just wanting to connect it maybe to the discussion this morning about different political cultures and how that relates to media. So I think Professor Jasanoff alluded to this idea of civic epistemology, so how different societies have ways of getting at the truth and how that might actually change across mass democracies. And I thought one really interesting provocation with that was talking about in the German case, this anxiety around losing a kind of consensus position and the role that the media might actually play in that. And I was wondering just if that might change how you're thinking about the US case as well, which I think you're getting a lot at in your work, Justin. But maybe a question of whether it's a good or a bad thing that in the US case there is sort of a polarized aspect to it, because it seems one of the ways in which Americans do seem to get at truth is by having kind of all-out contests between different warring factions, and the media sort of reflects that, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. So is that a pathology from the standpoint of an American civic epistemology, or is it just something that might be different from a consensus-based way of getting at truth that Professor Jasanoff was saying is maybe more something in the German context that one sees?
Thanks, Owen. That's a great question. And I think you're right to bring up the idea that, that there is a very different sort of civic epistemology in the United States that is historically much more contestory than an idea of everyone reaching a sort of consensus. What I think I do want to respond with, though, is that might be true, but there's a difference between polarized conflict between viewpoints and a sort of fragmentation into epistemic models. And I think that the key text in the American tradition that makes this point is Federalist 10. Madison talks about American democracy, sort of, there's no real civic culture to speak of. It's 1780s. Everyone lives in these little hamlets out in the woods. Takes months to get information to each other, and so there's this very real threat of epistemic fragmentation. And it's not that Madison thinks that by linking everyone together in this constitutional order, that you're going to reach some sort of consensus. It's more that you set up the right conditions and infrastructure to ensure that different groups are able to sort of learn about one another, and so that the conflicts can sort of emerge between them in a more productive way, in a way that isn't just prefaced on the fact that no one knows about what's going on, hundreds of miles away in some village that they've never heard of. And so in that sense, I think that you can have a civic culture that isn't consensus-oriented, but it still requires the same sort of institutions to do that bridging work, to avoid a sort of disaggregation. And I think that's sort of one of the things that, at least in my thinking about journalism, is that it's one of its key functions is to try to maintain conflict, maintain the fact that there are lots of different perspectives, and enable us to learn about them across social and geographic barriers, without assuming that it's going to reach some final settled consensus or truth.
Yes, in the back.
Thank you. I'm Derek Flakel. I'm MPP at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I had a question for Professor Siegel. Justin sort of points to a more participatory, citizen-directed form of journalism as one of the potential cures for these problems. But as Matt pointed out, that creates a sort of cognitive burden on citizens, many of whom just kind of want to live their lives and don't necessarily want to have to be gathering information, defining journalistic frames for themselves. So what kinds of solutions, both in theory and in journalistic practice, could result in a fair, representative, and fairly accurate form of citizen-directed journalism?
Yeah, thanks. I took Matt to be talking about sort of context of the context of sort of expert information, and I guess there's a sort of analog of Matt's scenarios of like, well, you want to know who you share polity with? Well, go down and go to the southern neighborhood you never go to, and have a look around and have a chat and talk to people and so on, and then that would be a kind of burden, a burden that wouldn't it be better if you could just once in a while read a story about a story in the newspaper that related this place and the people in it to you. But that's not exactly citizen-driven in the sense of citizen journalism where people are like uploading a video to YouTube and Tahrir Square or something like that. So it's not exactly participatory. But if we're asking, well, what sorts of principles might promote that? That's one of the things I was trying to articulate. If principles that journalism should do that for you. There's another dimension though to what you're saying, and this has been explored in some interesting proposals about kind of citizen-led journalism, which is a sort of model where the membership model where people are kind of pitching stories as kind of directionality that's not just from the journalists to the publics, but the other way too. So not just like a crime tip or a correction, but an actual idea for a story or something. And it's people who are already doing politics have their press releases and so on. But what if there was another category of that? And I don't know how much of that would be a burden, in the sense of like, okay, instead of being the person, whoever it is in the newsroom who's like generating stories, it's sort of outsourced a little bit to people. But you do sometimes have the sense that people come across stories just as easily as journalists do, maybe even more so. So you could imagine an ethos in which there was that directionality just as a thing to explore.
Austin?
Yeah, hi, so I guess I have a question for Matt. And so my question is a little bit about I'm curious kind of how you're how you're sort of slicing your argument to be maybe just about speech, or if it's not just about speech, right? I mean, you said the right to not be misled. But I'm sort of thinking kind of from a Marxist tradition and from kind of critical studies in technology, how we're misled by Like pieces of technology, for example, right? Like how using Twitter, we're obviously misled. On the one hand, there's people sitting in San Francisco treating us like products while we, at the same time, think we're there kind of for something else. And same thing can kind of be said in like the Marxist tradition, or it can be said of like infrastructure from kind of different literature in STS, where we might think about infrastructure as misleading us, where something might look like a bench, maybe from architecture, but it's really a device to protect people in the street. And so I'm just kind of curious, you have all these different ways in which one is kind of led through the world and through a kind of interpretive flexibility of being here. And how are you sort of thinking about demarcating that in the sense of like, I as an autonomous individual have this thought, right? And maybe you have a better way of saying this.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is reflective of me orienting this in a sort of in a discussion framework which is really dominated by attempts to regulate or do something about misinformation, like policy attempts to crack down on misinformation, but they keep butting up against the freedom of speech right, and sort of that being the kind of big challenge. So I'm sort of thinking about misinformation or sort of misleading, I guess, primarily as a form of speech. I wonder, maybe similar things could be said about misdirection in general. Like it might be the case that respecting the autonomy of an agent involves structuring their choice environment in a certain way, such that you're not sort of funneling them into a particular predetermined output or a sort of particular predetermined choice that they're going to make, but sort of opening things up to them in a certain way. That just seems like a much broader question than sort of what I'm trying to tackle or what I can tackle. It's probably not very satisfying, but maybe we can talk about it further.
Sheila.
Thank you for really three very fascinating philosophers' takes on some of the same territory that we try to cover from a different angle. So, Justin, just coming back to you, these invocations of Federalist 10 always leave me a little bit cold. But if you're really going to be historical, Edmund Burke was writing at roughly the same time, if you want to look at long, short centuries or whatever, and was talking about the same sort of fragmentation and factionalism. So it's not just an American illness, and there was a prescription that he is historically associated with, which is the formation of political parties, but that hasn't exactly been the solution that has worked out in America in a sense. So, I think that one has to be a little bit careful whether one is oneself turning into a bit of a strict constructionist of American history by taking the present back to Federalist papers. But that's a throwaway aside. I think the more important point is if the media, like any of our institutions, are themselves the product of a political culture, in trying to reform them to be something outside of that political culture in a sense, what exactly is the prescription? What other thing do they, if we as STS scholars and political theorists are to some degree right in saying that how one produces public knowledge and public reason is itself a feature of democracy that has to some extent been under-theorized, and that our major institutions to some extent are reflective of exactly those choices. Why do we carry out our political battles in terms of truth if it were not for the civic epistemological position of, quote, the truth, unquote, in this polity? And take everyday examples. The Washington Post counted week by week, month by month, how many lies Donald Trump had said. Everybody agrees that Boris Johnson is every bit as much an inveterate liar as Donald Trump, right? But there has been no count done by any British paper, to my knowledge, of the number of lies Boris Johnson tells. Instead, it's the blatancy of the lies about having boozy parties on Downing Street, which are things that any average person can look at and say, these guys are having wine and cheese and he's saying it's an office break. So that's this resort to common sense that, you know, what everybody visually can attest to, which has been a feature of British political culture, but they're not counting the number of, and the liberal media are not lining up. The Guardian is not counting. It's counting American police fatalities. It's not counting Boris Johnson's lies. So, I mean, you know, if you're really attuned to the sort of political ethnography, you see the media themselves behaving in certain ways that underscore and reproduce these elements of political culture. So what exactly is the prescription? That the media suddenly should reconstitutionalize themselves?
Oh, it's a great question, and I appreciate it so much. And it is incredibly important to look comparatively. So as you say, yes, the epistemic culture that gets formed, civic epistemology, is a product of the design of media systems. The consensus-oriented German system, sort of historically very contested British media ecosystem, or at least with print side, sort of at least the past 100 years, centralized public broadcasting, it dominates sort of the other side, non-print. Like, these things are all products of this interaction between political culture and media institutions. And I think what that should do is at least draw our attention to the role that institutional structures, infrastructure plays in in shaping some of that epistemic culture. And as political theorists, and I think democratic citizens, on one hand, we can take a step back and say, all right, what sort of ends should we be pursuing in this sort of, in terms of civic epistemology? What sort of values do we think our public discourse ought to realize? And then take a hard look at the institutions that we have and evaluate whether or not they're helping us realize those ends or not. So it's not to say that we can intuit the perfect form of media system ought to take, or that we'd be able to somehow step outside of our political culture and the set of presuppositions that we come into this sort of policy thinking with. It's that we have some sort of obligation to muddle through and to see our media institutions as sites of experimentation and potentially democratic agency, rather than, at least that sometimes gets thrown up in legal discussions or even among political theorists, that there's sort of these external constraints outside of politics. I think the point highlights the exact contingency of these institutions, and so you know, that they can be, you know, we as democratic publicists can do work on them, just as, you know, we might our electoral system or our you know, finance system or something like that.
I'll definitely buy the site of experimentation formulation in a way that I would not buy the transcendental truth-telling formulation.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Yakub Bangesh from the South Asia Institute. Well, to an extent it's a question, but to an extent it's just me thinking out loud. So the panel has been talking about sort of journalism as, you know, and journalists as just a category. And I was just thinking that if we separate journalism to an extent between, say, print journalism, electronic and new media, how would all these three categories respond to what you are saying? You know, how would they react to it? And perhaps as a subcategory, I would also add journalistic platforms or journalistic things, because of course they are engaging with the same kinds of questions. So how do you think these three categories and this one small subcategory would relate to what you're saying? It's kind of a broad question.
It's actually appropriate to have a broad question as the last question, that each of you can
Yeah.
weigh in on the subject matter and whatever else has come to mind in the meantime, as far as the questions were concerned that were not respectively directed at you. So maybe.
What were the three categories?
Oh, so print, electronic and new media, and then journalistic platforms.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Narrow.
Yeah, so I guess one question is like, you know, just thanks. Is, you know, what is journalism? Does it cut across? Does it cut across? So there's a sort of like, you know, form, the medium in which it happens, and then there's the content of it, and there's interesting interactions between them, such as just the fact that, you know, back when there newspapers where the unit was the whole, instead of the unit being the story, that all on its own is, as Ben Anderson pointed out long, in imagined communities already has a kind of political effect. So I guess I'm thinking that when I was talking about the kind of like, journalistic writing, that's kind of something that happens at the level of the story. And so it cuts across, it's sort of orthogonal to the format questions. But then if we ask, well, what is journalism when we're focusing on that kind of writing? In talking about the principles that should regulate that thing, I was intending to talk about, intending to talk about something that could happen in print, it could happen in other formats, sort of cuts across those forms, but what distinguishes it is, there's various professional norms. Not anybody can, anybody maybe could be a journalist, but not everybody is instantly a journalist, because it does have this kind of proprietary set of skills and so on. And I mean, it's not to say that you don't want to fight over the word. There's all sorts of modes of contributing to public, mass communication. But I was focused on the reason I was focused on the sort of like, professionalized institution that kind of came of age in the 1920s thereabouts in the United States and then moved to other places too. The reason I focused on that is because I think it does have a kind of it has very explicit method principles, but it has only a sort of very vague implicit content principle. The content principle is say what's important. And then I was trying to press on, well, what more could we say if we wanted to get underneath that a little bit, with a special focus on, what might cultivate as opposed to inhibit democracy, and what role might that have as a bulwark or insurance against the kinds of declines we're seeing now.
Sure. So my thought, it sort of ties back to one of the previous questions about what the sort of practical upshot is for our sort of media institutions generally. I think one thing that we can do is sort of set out principles that carry across cases, and then as we look at specific instances, sort of think about how that applies to specific medium. So on one hand, one of the virtues I think of, less of it in that it doesn't matter that it's journalism platforms or broadcast or print, but rather different registers of media. So on the local level, you have local blogs that are sort of a little less hierarchical, a little bit more freeform. You've got local TV, you've got local newspapers. What matters at the local level is that you can facilitate a sort of participation, as Susanna was saying. People come forward with stories. Like journalism is already sort of participatory, at least on the local level in this way. Journalists go out and seek out stories, but most of the time, at least, so before I started studying political theory, I was a local newspaper journalist. And at least for me, it's like all the best stories I ever wrote were someone shooting me an email or giving me a call that said like, hey, go forward this thing. And that was true of the people who were working sort of on blogs. That was true of people who were working at the sort of TV stations that were nearby. And so I think maybe the relevant access is less the medium and more the register at which news is being gathered and how. So that local news can function in a very different way, regardless of its platform, if it's broadcast or if it's print, than national news can or sort of global news can. Which is to say that there's going to be very big differences between each of those, and I don't have clear ways to articulate them all, but there's another way that we can subdivide it as well.
Should I just say something quickly to finish off?
What goes to you, Matt?
All right. So yeah. So just to relate to this, to sort of what I was talking about in my discussion. I mentioned that we're interested in whether there's like a right to truth or a closely related right, that the one that I'm interested in, which is a sort of a right against misinformation or a negative right against being misled in certain ways. And I said that I'm interested in conceiving of rights as kind of protections on basic interests and freedoms from systematic threats in the form of like close to all things considered reasons for restrictions on certain kinds of speech or content or whatever, at least in this case. And so it sort of seems that the difference between different types of media from the perspective of articulating like a right to truth or an anti-misinformation right. One difference that would be really important is to look at the systematicity of the threat and sort of the scale and the extent and the possibility of virality, things like that. And it sort of seems like that's one set of features with like new online media, social media, and even the dissemination of like sort of traditional news like by repetition online, which could sort of take something that's not ordinarily a candidate for restriction on the basis of an anti-misinformation right and make it one once it reaches a certain level of systematicity. Yeah, that's.
Okay, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.